On that grey morning, the smell of cornmeal porridge already filled the hallways, but few people noticed Donna Marlene, the lunch lady with her simple uniform and attentive gaze. She walked slowly to the kitchen, carrying a mental list of chores that no one ever asked about, but she insisted on completing meticulously. No one knew exactly how many years she'd been there, but it felt like she'd been a part of the school forever. Teachers hurried past, children ran distractedly, and she walked on, invisible, mingling with the clanking of pots and the smell of coffee with milk. That day, the mood was different. A severe virus had taken out half the morning teachers. The principal paced back and forth, speaking softly on the phone, trying to find substitutes. The playground was packed with small children, restless and lost, unsure of what to do. Marlene watched the chaos from afar, feeling a tightness in her chest, the kind of situation that often spirals out of control quickly. For a moment, she thought of her son, so often left to his own devices because she had to work. She hesitated, but took a deep breath, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to the principal, bringing with her a courage she thought she had forgotten. The principal, accustomed to seeing Marlene alone between the pots and the cafeteria, was surprised when she heard the proposal. "If you want, I can stay with the children until someone arrives. I've worked in the classroom before, so I know how to calm this class down." At first, she hesitated. It was strange to imagine the lunch lady suddenly becoming a makeshift teacher. But faced with the emergency, she relented, with a hurried gesture and a look of hidden relief. Marlene led the little ones to the art room, where light filtered in faintly through the tall windows. As they settled into their chairs, she felt her heart race, as if returning to a forgotten place. She remembered the years she taught reading and writing, the joy of seeing a student form their first word. She also felt the pain of the forced pause when she had to drop everything to care for her son after a difficult diagnosis without the time or money to pursue her own dreams. The children were surprised at first. They were used to Marlene in the kitchen, always behind a counter, wearing a flowered apron and a smirk, asking if they wanted another ladle of beans. Now she sat in a circle with them, calling out their names one by one, something that surprised even the most restless, since few teachers could remember them all. The little ones looked at each other as if trying to guess what would come next, suspicious that this morning would be different. Some whispered about the scent of seasoning that still seemed to linger in the air as she passed. To others, she was just the snack lady, but at that moment something began to change in the way they looked at her. As she tidied up the board and pulled some colored paper from an old box, Marlene felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She remembered her early years of teaching, the nights grading notebooks with her young son sleeping beside her, the school meetings where she was listened to and respected. She missed those times like someone missing a place that was once home. But there was also another memory, the days of struggle in the hospital with her son, the fear of losing him, the decision to give up everything to be a constant presence during his treatment. There, in the room full of noisy children and curious eyes, she felt a mixture of pride and loss, almost as if she was slowly recovering a forgotten part of herself. At the beginning of class, the silence was tense, as if each child was waiting for the first mistake from that aunt who wasn't wearing a teacher's coat. Marlene, feeling the judgmental gaze of even the quietest children, began telling a simple story, a memory of her childhood on a remote farm, where she had learned to count using bean seeds and soda bottle caps. Gradually, the children began to relax, some giggling softly, others shifting in their chairs to get a better look. Marlene noticed their small hands, their worn sneakers, the mix of curiosity and need written on each face. The smell of soap from the freshly washed floor mingled with the scent of childhood, and in that simple setting, she realized how much she missed someone who truly saw each of them. As she taught, Marlene paid attention to the details. The boy in the back, who wouldn't take off his cap, The girl who hid her hands in her sleeves, the little girl with her hair perpetually tangled, biting her pencil with anxiety. She remembered her own son, the signs of restlessness that only she could see. Gently, she adapted the activities. She asked each child to draw something they liked at home. Let a boy bring crayons to a classmate who was too shy to get up. She noticed how small gestures generated shy smiles. Soon, the room began to come alive, and the initial tension turned into a lively buzz, full of questions, laughter, and even a song invented on the spot, improvised by those who felt welcomed. In a moment of pause, as she picked up a crumpled piece of paper from the floor, Marlene looked out the window and saw a light rain beginning to fall on the empty courtyard. The sound of the drops hitting the tiles transported her to another time, when she would run through her mother's house to close the windows before everything got wet. She felt the same old urgency, but this time it was different. She was there by choice, holding herself silently to keep the accumulated weariness of so many years from showing. The smell of chalk and old paper mingled with the soft scent of the cheap soap she used, and she noticed how familiar small details of the school were. The chipped locker, the chairs scratching the floor, the chalkboard bearing the marks of other days and other hands. The environment was simple, almost precarious, but there was something homey about it all. As she walked between the desks, Marlene noticed how each child carried a story within themselves. The tight shoes, the patched uniform, the gaze that avoided hers when she asked something more personal. She felt a deep pang in her chest as she realized that many of those little ones had never had a teacher who truly understood their struggles. She remembered when her son came home from school, sad because no one had the patience to understand his ways. She thought of the mothers who, like her, carried the world on their shoulders and hoped those children would find at least one good memory that day. With a simple gesture, she took an old book from the shelf and began to read aloud, changing the tone for each character, eliciting genuine laughter and leaving the room, for the first time that morning, at peace. Halfway through reading, Marlene noticed a small girl sitting near the door, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her hair fell across her face, hiding a sad, suspicious expression. She recognized that look. It was the same one she saw in her son on days when the world seemed too big for him. Without interrupting the story, Marlene slid a colored piece of paper onto the girl's desk, along with a blue crayon, her son's favorite. She said nothing, just smiled slightly. The girl looked up hesitantly, and in that brief contact, Marlene felt a bridge forming silently between them. It was in these small, almost invisible gestures that she knew she could transform someone's day. More than teaching letters or numbers, she wanted to give the feeling of welcome that was so lacking there. As the morning wore on, the children began sharing secrets, sketching dreams, and inventing games, each finding their own space around Marlene. She noticed how their behavior changed when they felt heard. Even the most rebellious ones softened, trying to impress her with exaggerated drawings or made-up stories. Marlene saw herself in each of them, remembering when she was a child and needed attention but received only demands. Time seemed to flow differently there. The early morning anguish gave way to a lighter, almost joyful rhythm. She knew that behind their games, there were deep needs, stories of abandonment, hunger, fear, heavy realities for someone so young. And yet she felt filled with a silent hope, the kind that only exists when one truly believes in the possibility of a life changing, even if only for a single day. During recess, Marlene returned to the kitchen to prepare the children's snacks. The smell of fresh bread and coffee with milk filled the hallway, drawing anxious glances from the students. She felt proud to see some of the little ones waiting for her by the door, asking about the story they'd heard and if there would be another one after snack. At that moment, the usual snack routine seemed to take on a new meaning. The care taken with each plate, the attention to serving the ripest fruit to those who seemed to need it, was a silent way of showing she cared. She remembered the time when her son would only eat when she sat with him, inventing games for each spoonful. She thought of how many children there might eat alone at home, without anyone to notice if they'd had a difficult or happy day. Every simple gesture, an extra piece of cake, a smile, a look, became a temporary refuge in a world that for many was made of absences. As the children ate, Marlene found herself observing the school as if from the outside. She noticed the peeling walls, the murals with old drawings, and the hastily written notes from the administration. Everything there exuded weariness and improvisation, but also resistance. She felt the weight of anonymity, so many years serving, often invisible, listening to conversations from afar without being called to participate. It was as if her life had been suspended in that uniform, waiting for the day someone would see her beyond the lunch. But seeing the children smile and share stories, she realized that even in the quietest role, she could still be someone's beacon of light. The feeling of usefulness, long forgotten, slowly returned, filling her chest with a gentle courage, the kind that doesn't need shouting to be felt. At the end of recess, the children returned to the classroom, with breadcrumbs in their pockets and small juice stains on their uniforms. Marlene asked everyone to sit in a circle and, picking up an old guitar forgotten in the corner, began strumming a simple melody. She wasn't a musician, but she knew that a well-chosen song could soothe anguish and open the door for confidences. She sang a children's song her mother had taught her, blending her voice with childhood memories of afternoons when the house would fill with noise and the smell of baking cake. The children, shy at first, soon joined in, some clapping, others making up lyrics and even improvised dances. There, for a few minutes, time seemed suspended. The difficulties outside, the hidden pain, everything dissolved in the awkward harmony of children's voices. Marlene was moved, feeling that somehow she was giving back to those children a bit of the embrace and joy that life had taken from her. After the song, she proposed an activity she used to do in her old teaching days. She asked each child to draw what a happy day meant to them. As she walked around the tables, she noticed each child's dedication, the hurried or careful lines, the carefully chosen colors. She saw drawings of simple houses, families gathered together, tables laden with food, and others with lonely figures, sad looks, storms in the background. A girl showed her a drawing of hands holding hands, faceless but with giant hearts in place of breasts. Marlene felt a lump in her throat. The girl smiled shyly, as if asking permission to believe it could be real. In that moment, Marlene realized that the greatest gift she could give was not a ready-made lesson, but an invitation to dream, even amidst the hardships of everyday life. Each colored page became a silent cry of hope, the kind that doesn't fade easily. As the drawings piled up on the table, Marlene had a brief moment of inner silence, glancing at the wall clock that read almost noon. It was always this time, years ago, when she would prepare to pick up her son from rehabilitation school. She remembered the daily weight of carrying other people's expectations on her shoulders, of being the mother who left everything behind, of the feeling of having lost her own identity due to caregiving. Now, faced with those childlike gazes, she felt her identity resurfacing, less as nostalgia, more as rediscovery. Her body, marked by fatigue, felt strangely light. Every movement, gathering the pencils, sorting the drawings, arranging the chairs, took on new meaning, as if there she were building a place of belonging for herself and for others. In the corner of the room, the boy with the cap remained silent, distracted by a paper airplane he was folding in secret. Marlene approached unhurriedly, crouching down to his level. "Show me how to make this airplane?" she asked, not imposing authority, just genuine curiosity. The boy hesitated, then began folding the paper slowly, explaining each step in a barely audible whisper. Marlene listened attentively, repeating the gesture until she got it right. His expression changed, a mixture of surprise and pride. It was the first time that day that he felt like part of the group. Marlene knew what it was like to feel unseen, and in that small ritual she silently celebrated the achievement. It wasn't a grand victory, but it was real, and in that context, that was enough. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to peek timidly through the clouds, casting golden flecks across the worn floor of the classroom. Marlene felt a subtle warmth on her face, as if the light also renewed her energy. The noise of the children gradually faded, overcome by a sense of security rarely found there. Often school was merely a shelter from the street, a temporary refuge from the chaos outside. But that day, Marlene realized that, even without promises or grand speeches, she could transform that space into a small safe haven, at least for the duration of the school day. As she looked at the walls, covered in fingerprints and old drawings, she thought of everything she'd left behind. The classroom that had once been hers, her employment record as a teacher, her dreams of career, advancement. She felt a pang of longing mixed with acceptance. It wasn't possible to recover everything, but perhaps it was possible to build something new based on what she still had. Experience, affection, the sensitivity to notice what almost no one else saw. The weight of the past didn't disappear, but as she looked at the children, now playing freely on the floor, Marlene understood that her worth no longer depended on titles or recognition. It lay, above all, in care and genuine presence. Outside, the school's activity was beginning to return to normal. A few teachers who had managed to arrive were passing through the hallways, visibly exhausted, but surprised to see the children calm and engaged in activities. An aide entered the classroom and, for a moment, observed Marlene with a curious expression, as if trying to decipher this figure she had previously only associated with lunch. Marlene smiled back, saying nothing, simply continuing to guide the children as if she had been doing it for years. There was a naturalness in her gestures, something that came from within, from someone who knew the difficult terrain of public education and knew that patience was the greatest asset in weathering storms. When the children were released for free time in the playground, Marlene remained alone in the classroom for a few minutes. She sat at the table, looking at the drawings left behind, and let her fatigue surface. It was an old fatigue, not just physical. It was also of invisibility, of not being called by name, of having her story reduced to her uniform. There, amidst scribbled papers and misaligned chairs, she allowed herself to feel proud. Proud of having made a difference, even if only for that day, of having reclaimed her teacher's voice, and of having given the children something they might never forget, the certainty that they are seen, that they deserve care. And, for herself, a silent lesson. There was still room to begin again. At the end of the day, when the last child left the classroom and the playground was emptying, Marlene allowed herself to be alone for a few minutes, listening to the echo of children's voices that still lingered in the air. Her entire body ached, from her feet, accustomed to long hours on her feet, to her hands, calloused from so much work and care, and especially her chest, where a heavy mixture of exhaustion and joy resided. She looked at each drawing left on the table and felt that there was more than just colorful scribbles. They were pieces of life, small confessions of happiness and longing, dreams drawn by those who are rarely invited to dream. Marlene remembered all the days she would leave school straight for the bus, carrying grocery bags and worries, wondering if she had done enough, if she had managed everything. But in that moment she realized that the difference isn't always made in great achievements. Sometimes it happens in the silence, in the routine, in the simple gesture that no one sees. She allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment, and in that time she reviewed her entire story: the girl who loved to study, the young woman full of plans, the tired mother, the silent lunch lady, and now, once again, the teacher for a day. As she picked up the pencils from the floor and put away the chairs, she felt the day had changed something fundamental in her. It wasn't just about returning to teaching or reminiscing about old times. It was, above all, about being recognized as a whole person, with a past, pain, and skills that never fade. Marlene thought about her son waiting at home, about the simple dinner she would prepare soon, about the small challenges of the next day. But she carried, along with her usual bags, a different feeling. That it was possible, yes, to start over, even when life insists on making us believe otherwise. The path might not be easy. There might be no audience, no medals, no new contracts signed. But there was self-respect, and a new hope born from that honest contact with the children. And for the first time in many years, Marlene walked through the school gates without haste, carrying with her the certainty that, even invisible, she was essential. On the walk home, Marlene felt her body cry out for rest, but her mind refused to shut down. The street was familiar, full of potholes and colourful houses, and she greeted distracted neighbours without much thought, still caught up in the day's events. Each step was laden with memories of rushing out to take her son to therapy, of crossing those same sidewalks carrying heavy backpacks and bags, of dreaming of returning to the classroom, even though she knew self-care would always be her priority. But that afternoon, there was a subtle difference. She wasn't walking hunched over with the slumped shoulders of someone carrying only obligations. She walked more upright, feeling that somehow she had rediscovered a part of herself she'd left behind. At home, upon opening the door, the smell of beans cooking on the stove mingled with the sound of the low television and the clatter of pots and pans in the sink. Her son, now grown, smiled at her arrival, a smile that said it all without words. Marlene sat in the kitchen, took a deep breath and realized that this familiar routine could also be the setting for invisible achievements. As she prepared her son's meal, she remembered the children at school, the stories she'd heard, the looks of gratitude, and the small victories of the day. She realized that even after so many sacrifices, it was still possible to bring about change, sometimes big, sometimes small, but always real. And she understood there, among spoons and pots, that a new beginning didn't need to be grandiose. It was enough to be genuine, made of everyday gestures, the kind that only those who experience it firsthand can appreciate. After dinner, as she washed the dishes in the dim kitchen light, Marlene let her mind wander over the details of the day. Each child, each word, each drawing took on new meaning in the fresh memory of someone who feels pride mixed with longing. The warm water trickled through her fingers, bringing a subtle relief, but her thoughts kept returning to the shy girl's gaze and the restrained smile of the boy in the cap. She wondered if she had truly managed to touch those hearts, if she had left any mark beyond the tasks she had accomplished. The fear of not being enough haunted her thoughts like an ancient ghost, one that is difficult to banish. But along with this fear came a feeling of gratitude for having had the chance to reinvent herself, even if only for a few hours, and remind herself of what she was capable of. Before falling asleep, already lying in her quiet room, Marlene thought about everything that lay ahead. She knew that the next day her routine would return to normal. The apron, the pots and pans, the quick conversations at snack time. Maybe no one would comment on what had happened. Maybe everything would remain the same, as if that day had been just another one among many. But inside her, nothing would be the same. She now carried a vivid memory, a silent turning point that made her see her own worth with new eyes. She knew that even without recognition, she had found the meaning to stay. Life, she understood, was made of these small, almost invisible, yet profoundly transformative moments. And as sleep slowly arrived, Marlene allowed herself to smile again, feeling that somehow she had found her place in the world again. The next morning, the alarm clock rang early as usual, but there was something different about the way Marlene got up. Her body complained of fatigue, but her mind felt lighter, still occupied by images from the previous day. As she made coffee and straightened her uniform, she felt a small surge of pride in herself, the kind you never announce to anyone. She looked at her reflection in the window, and for a moment saw not only the usual lunch lady, but also the teacher, the whole woman who still had so much to give. It was strange how a single day could change so much inside, even when the world outside remained the same. On the way to school, Marlene noticed that the city was already beginning to stir. Vendors on street corners, children with backpacks, the noisy bus rushing by. The sky was clearer, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves on the trees, bringing a subtle freshness to the start of the day. Each step seemed firmer, as if she now walked with renewed purpose. She mentally replayed the conversations, the smiles, and even the small difficulties of the previous day, trying to retain everything that was important. At the school gate, before entering, she paused for a second and took a deep breath. She knew the demands and invisibility would return, but she also knew, with a new certainty, that no one could take from her what she had lived and transformed. What was born there, she thought, was not just hope, it was truly strength. As she crossed the courtyard, Marlene noticed that some of the staff were looking at her differently. It was no longer that automatic, almost distracted look that always followed her while serving lunch. There was a certain silent respect, perhaps even curiosity, as if they finally saw someone beyond the apron. She greeted everyone politely, as always, but felt deep down that the previous day had left its mark, not only on her, but on the school as well. The principal hurried past, said a more lingering good morning and smiled, signaling an almost shy acknowledgement. Marlene knew deep down that even small gestures could be the beginning of something bigger, a breach, a space for new stories, new encounters, new opportunities to be seen and heard. Later, as she prepared the children's lunch, Marlene let her thoughts run wild, lulled by the steam from the pans and the distant sound of laughter coming from the hallway. She felt proud of what she had accomplished, but she didn't romanticize her journey. She knew how hard it had been to get there, the sleepless nights, the constant fear of failing as a mother, as a professional, as a woman. She remembered her son, how much she had had to fight for care, for respect, for dignity, and reflected that everything she did had deep down the same meaning, to make the world less hostile, more welcoming, even if it was just inside a public school on the outskirts of town. The smell of cooked rice, mingled with an old childhood memory of food made with love and shared with those who matter. And in that moment, Marlene understood that every small action, no matter how small, has the power to create bonds and leave beautiful scars, the kind that don't hurt, but remind us of the strength to start over every day anew. In the middle of the afternoon, a group of children ran into the kitchen, laughing loudly, carrying colorful notebook paper with drawings they'd made in class. Marlene stopped what she was doing, dried her hands on her apron, and received these improvised gifts with the same excitement as someone receiving a treasure. One of the girls handed her a piece of paper with the phrase, "Thank you for yesterday, Aunt Marlene," written in large, awkward letters, surrounded by hearts and smiley faces. Her heart sank, a mixture of joy and surprise. It wasn't just the recognition, but the confirmation that, even in a discreet and fleeting role, she had left a mark. The children chatted excitedly, asking her to keep the drawings, promising they'd come back another day to show her more. Marlene realized she was finally being called by name, not just as Snack Aunt, but as someone important, someone real. The weight of belonging was new and good, as if each gesture from that previous day had taken deep root in everyone there. When silence returned to the kitchen, she sat down to rest for a moment, allowing herself to feel the true impact of that collective gesture. It was as if all the effort, The sacrifices and the hours of feeling invisible had finally been answered. The children's recognition was genuine, unlike the formal praise that sometimes appeared at meetings and ended up forgotten. It was an everyday acknowledgement from those who noticed the attention to detail, the well-prepared food, the smile offered even on difficult days. Marlene remembered her early years as a teacher, when she believed she would change the world, and realized that in a way she still could, not in the way she dreamed of in her youth, but through shared affection, through the silent example of those who resist and reinvent themselves each day. There, in the simplicity of the school kitchen, she discovered that overcoming obstacles isn't always about overcoming grand challenges, but about transforming small daily battles into victories that no one can take away. At the end of the day, with the pots and pans washed and the cafeteria silent, Marlene sat alone for a few minutes, gazing out the window at the slow movement of the street. The sky was already changing colors, heralding the beginning of night, and she allowed herself this moment of pause, so rare in these busy days. Her body felt exhausted, but her soul strangely light. She mentally replayed every moment since the day before, the first timid conversation with the children, the fear of not being able to cope, the unexpected happiness of small, acknowledged gestures. She thought about the principal, her colleagues, how their gaze had changed slightly, even though there was still distance. But above all, she thought about herself, the woman who had survived so much and still kept going. There, in that stillness, she felt like giving thanks for the chance to start over. Not in a grand way, but in a real, small, solid way, like everything she had built with effort and care. Leaving school, walking slowly through the streets lit only by streetlights, Marlene felt she was carrying a different story home. It was as if a new certainty had been born within her, that she didn't need to wait for recognition from others to value her own journey. Overcoming obstacles, she realized, came not only from heroic acts, but from paying close attention to the needs of others, from the willingness to make a difference, even when no one sees. She remembered her son, her difficult childhood, the days when everything seemed lost. She smiled, thinking that, despite the marks of time and disappointments, she had managed to keep alive the desire to care, and more importantly, to continue believing that every gesture of affection, no matter how small, had a greater impact than she could measure. On the way home, her pace was slow, but her heart was stronger, carrying the good relief of someone who knows they are no longer invisible, not even to themselves. In the days that followed, the school routine returned to normal. Teachers present, homework distributed, lunch served at the same times. But something had changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, to the hurried eye. The children began to greet Marlene with more enthusiasm. Some even made a point of helping her set the tables or fetch the cutlery. At times, she caught looks of admiration, where before there had been only indifference. The staff began to strike up conversations, curious about her story, and one teacher shyly asked if she could help with a special afternoon class activity. Marlene accepted without hesitation, feeling that, finally, her presence there carried weight. She was no longer just a silent figure behind the counter. She was a reference, a fond memory for anyone who crossed the school gates during those difficult times. The transformation wasn't just external. Inside, Marlene felt more whole, less marked by her previous wounds. Her old fears still existed, of course, but now they were no longer paralyzing. She felt capable of facing daily challenges with renewed courage, the courage of someone who knows they can make mistakes, stumble, but can also start over whenever necessary. At home, her son noticed the difference, commenting on the different sparkle in his mother's eyes. They laughed together, sharing simple stories from everyday life, and Marlene thought that this was perhaps her greatest victory, having kept hope alive even when all seemed lost. She felt proud not only of the teacher she had been, but of the woman she was now, resilient, affectionate, full of scars and strength. And she, Understood finally that overcoming isn't about erasing the pains of the past, but learning to carry them lightly, transforming each one into a source of compassion and meaning. As the weeks passed, small changes accumulated, shaping a lighter day-to-day life at school. The children, more confident, began sharing not only stories, but also worries, problems at home, nighttime fears, missing a distant relative. Marlene listened to each confession respectfully, without judging or rushing the outburst. Often just being there, available to listen, was enough to ease the burden each child carried. And with each conversation, she recognized pieces of her own story, the absences, the silences, the struggle to be noticed and respected, even in the smallest things. This silent bond, woven day after day, transformed lunch into a moment of sharing. It was more than food, it was care, it was presence. She realized she didn't need grand gestures to change the mood. All it took was an attentive look, a note left by the plate, a whispered encouragement. Little by little, she became a trusted figure for those who rarely had anyone to count on. One of those days, the principal called Marlene in for a chat, praising the positive impact she had made on the children and suggesting she help with educational integration projects. Marlene felt her heart race, simultaneously anxious and happy. It was a chance to use everything she knew, everything she had learned from life and from her own son. She accepted the invitation, aware that new challenges would arise, but now without fear of not being able to cope. She felt truly valued, not only for her past as a teacher, but for the woman who continued to learn, to reinvent herself, to believe in affection as a path. And that afternoon, as she left the meeting, she looked up at the sky over Belo Horizonte and thought that finally life had given her something essential back. The right to be seen, and little by little, to dream again. Little by little, word of Marlene's actions that difficult mornings spread throughout the school community. Parents began asking who the aunt who became a teacher was, and some mothers began greeting her at the gate, thanking her for caring for their children. Marlene was surprised by this recognition, accustomed to going almost unnoticed even at major school events. She felt a mixture of shame and joy, as she hadn't yet gotten used to the attention, but there was also a quiet pride in finally having her story discovered. She realized that by sharing her life experience and tenderness with the children, she not only eased a crisis, but also paved the way for other staff members to be seen in a different light. The team began to exchange ideas more, sharing anxieties and achievements more openly, creating a silent but strong support network to weather the storms of everyday school life. One Friday, as the sun slowly sank behind the rooftops and the children filed out in small groups, Marlene allowed herself a moment of pause, sitting on the front steps. She looked at the school, at the hurried comings and goings of the community, and felt a rare peace. Overcoming, she understood, came not just from that day of unexpected courage, but from the silent accumulation of years of dedication, love, and endurance. It was made of small choices, getting up early even when exhausted, welcoming a shy student, listening to her son at the end of the day, not letting the past drown out her. A voice. There, that afternoon, Marlene saw clearly that she didn't need public recognition or grandiose stories to change her own path. She just had to keep going, one step at a time, honoring what she truly was, and knowing deep down that she was never invisible to those who truly mattered. On the last Monday of the month, Marlene arrived at school before sunrise, as she always had. As she walked through the gate, she smelled the fresh coffee mingling with the morning breeze and realized, for the first time in a long time, that she was truly at peace. She walked down the still silent hallway, ran her hand over the bulletin board filled with drawings and reminders, and realized how that school was as much a part of her as she was of that school. She knew the difficult days would continue, that not everything would always be filled with recognition or gratitude, but that no longer mattered as it once did. What mattered was knowing she was present, whole, and capable of transforming her. Daily life, with the silent weapons life had given her, patience, listening, affection, and an immense will to never give up. When the first children came running to hug her, Marlene felt the cycle was complete. Her place, finally, was no longer in the shadows, but right in the center of care, where she had always deserved to be. At the end of that day, back home, Marlene looked out the window at the darkening sky over Belo Horizonte and allowed herself to cry softly, with relief and joy. She thought about the path she had traveled, the losses, the choices, the days when only love had borne the burden. Now, more than ever, she understood that each difficult day, each silence, each unrecognized gesture had paved the way for that turning point. She didn't need spectacular stories to feel like a winner. It was enough to know that, with generosity and courage, she had managed to reinvent herself without losing her tenderness. She lay down, feeling light in her chest, grateful for being seen, but above all for finally seeing herself with truth and care. And as she fell asleep, she knew, with all the silent certainty of someone who has been through much, that she would never allow herself to be invisible again.